I'm terribly sorry I've forgotten to switch on the record. So this term, I'm going to deliver a course of lectures in classic English poetry of the 16th-20th century. I'm going to speak about the ages, the epochs, the authors, and the texts. The idea is that it's going to be interesting and useful, I hope, culturally, because we, of course, do have some knowledge of classic English authors like Shakespeare, but the overall picture of the development of English literature may be somewhat blurred, even with those who are interested in this question. And apart from the aesthetic pleasure, I hope you're going to receive some idea of how texts are connected with the biography of their authors, many of them very bright people, and I hope it will be amusing and entertaining and probably edifying to hear some facts of their biography. And of course, poetry is connected with the time when a certain poetic text was created. So the three things are coming together. And now I'm going to explain the title to make sure that we understand the general direction of our studies this term. When we speak about classic poetry, inevitably discussions begin of who can be awarded the title of a classic. And very often we speak about people who may be called living classics, and we say that a text created 10 years ago has equal rights with a text written 5 centuries ago for being called classic. Let's come to terms with definitions. When we're speaking about classics, usually we do not mean people who are writing at the moment or who have finished writing relatively late. The idea is that within the concept of classics, the general recognition over time, the chronological criterion, plays an important role. This is something that has been established within tradition and has passed the test of time. That's why it's reasonable to speak about classics when some time had passed and the general recognition remained. I'm not going to speak in any greater detail of who a classic is. It may be quite subjective, but the chronological criterion here is all important. And we may speak about neoclassical literature or living authors who may be considered classics, but at the same time, there are groups of texts about which we can be absolutely sure they may be called classical. So these are the subjects, these are the texts that we are going to discuss this term. Another question is connected with the reason why I'm bringing together authors, ages, and texts. In our handouts, we have several illustrations, and I will speak about this point a bit later during this lecture at greater detail. But the key point here is there are some texts which may be clear without any reference to the biography of their author, or without any reference to the time when the texts were created. lyrical poems are a very good illustration here. In some cases, it's necessary to know the general biographical information concerning the author, because in this case, if we lack this information, the text might be unclear. A good example of such text is Pushkin's Upas 3 and chapter. It is unclear generally why our national classic suddenly decided to use the word and to call a tree with the help of a word non-existent in the Russian language. So there was obviously something exotic about the whole idea of a poisonous tree, and we need to know certain facts of Pushkin's biography to understand why he decided to use this exotic appellation. And with some texts, it's necessary to pay attention to the more general historical context when those works were created. Because if we look at Hamlet just as at a text, it becomes absolutely unclear why the Danish prince was doing nothing for 5 acts, although in the very first act of the play he received a very clear order from the ghost of his father, and Hamlet had agreed with that order that he should go and kill the uncle. And then during the next 3 acts, nothing happens. Hamlet distracts himself constantly, either educating Ophelia or talking to actors, organizing a performance, in the meantime getting additional evidence that his father had been murdered by the uncle, and strangely Hamlet does nothing. And only in Act 5, when it was impossible already not to kill the uncle, he does what the ghost had asked him to do. And the situation in this case is very unclear. If we imagine Shakespeare's contemporaries watching this play, which was enormously popular, about 2,000 or 3,000 people could be placed simultaneously in the Globe Theatre where Shakespeare was working. So 2,000 or 3,000 people would be watching the Danish prince who is doing nothing instead of killing the uncle. And the play was popular. Either we might think that the contemporaries of Shakespeare collectively didn't care about any logic and were ready to watch a performance which, when performed in its full form, is lasting for 4 or 4.5 hours, and they were standing during the performance, most of them, so they were ready to watch the completely logical text, or on the contrary, there was some logic in what was going on for them, the inability to do what you need to do, and it was sufficiently relevant for them to make them tolerate this incoherent plot. From our point of view, it is incoherent. For them, it must have been coherent. And in this case, it's not merely the biography of Shakespeare that matters, but the explanation of the general political situation in the country, which made such a play seem relevant to the spectators. And in this case, the religious conflicts of the epoch, among other things, surprisingly, proved to be significant for the understanding of the text. So 3 variants, at least, exist. Texts may be understood as such in some cases. Texts may be understood if we know the biography of the author, and some texts should be understood both with reference to the biography of the author and the general historical, political, religious, economic information concerning the time the age when a certain text was created. So there can't be any unified method of interpretation. In different cases, we require either no extra-linguistic information, in some others, some kind of information is still necessary. And in the absence of the unified approach, we must think of understanding these texts and methods of providing this comprehension. In some cases, no information, in some cases, a lot of information, and the difference is quite significant. When we're going to work with concrete texts, we will see how the distinction works. So that's what we can say about the title of the course. The next question is, what do we know about classic English poetry generally, and about the history of the English language, which inevitably is directly connected with the history of English literature. When we speak about classic poetry, we often mention the 16th century as the period when it all began, and it is used in the title of my course as well. Why is the 16th century so often the turning point when we begin to speak about modern English classic poetry? There have been authors before the 16th century who are also considered classics. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer. He was born in 1340 and died in the year 1400. 1440-1400, and Chaucer is considered to be the genius of English literature and obviously a classic. But still, the 16th century is more frequently used as a starting point for considering classic English poetry. Why is it so? What was so specific about the 16th century English literature? To answer the question, we must think about the periods of the development of the English language. And the 16th century coincides with the beginning of some period in the history of the English language. What is this period? So, when it comes to periods, we usually speak about Old English, then comes Middle English, and then comes Modern English. And with the Old English, the period when it all began, it's probably somewhere the 6th century, and it lasted until the year 1066. Then Middle English began in 1066, and it lasted approximately until the year 1500. And then, beginning with 1500 till the year 1700, we have early modern English, and 1700 and onwards, it's modern English proper. I'm writing in the chat, so you may see these dates. So, what happened in the end of the 15th, beginning of the what happened in the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century that made a great difference and which makes us speak about the separate period in the history of the language. In the cultural history of Europe, a very important event took place which enables us to speak about some dramatic change in what came previously. And an early modern English period begins. What was the event? Что такого произошло в конце 15-го, начале 16 века, что позволяет нам говорить о раннем новоанглийском периоде?
Великий сдвиг гласных?
Нет, великий сдвиг будет позже. Великий сдвиг — это как раз ближе вот к 1700-му. События в культурной жизни Европы, когда резко поменялся способ существования языка. Изобретение книгопечатания. When printing was introduced, books became available to people on a much greater scale. And the varieties of literary language, which formerly had been accessible only to a relatively modest amount of people, became the property, became available to many more people. And a very active development of the language begins to take place. Various styles of the language begin to function not in an arbitrary fashion, but they become standardized. And it all happened because very many people received access to the same texts, and the life of the language stopped being connected only with the spoken word, where standardization was difficult to reach in the absence of television, the internet, and of printing, of course. To standardize spoken language, you need to have a good tradition of speaking and teaching, at least of speaking at schools. But when you have printed text, printed in the same way, and hundreds of copies or dozens of several thousand copies being spread, of course standardization becomes possible, and the lexical expansion is also observed. So that was the period when the English language began to exist on a completely different level, and literary texts, first of all, were written much more actively, not by a separate group, relatively modest in numbers of educated people, but by a much greater amount of them. And again, statistically, it became likely that when you have 10 texts, one of them may be brilliant. If you have 1,000, 10 or 15 may become brilliant. So it was the reason why the efflorescence of English literature took place at that time specifically. Just a second, I'm sorry, I have to answer the phone. Okay, so excuse me, we continue. So the 16th century is connected with the global spread of literacy, the standardization of the language due to printed material, and because so many people received access to what we may now call proper education, many more people became capable of creating their own texts. And if a lot of people are involved in this kind of activity, there is some likelihood that they will produce, some of them at least, certain very good texts. And William Shakespeare is, of course, the most obvious representative of the it might seem to us that Shakespeare cannot be the modern author according to our standards. When we read him, we come across certain constructions, not so numerous in fact, and we come across certain words which we definitely do not know. And some of us who are not very advanced students of English might think that Shakespeare generally belongs to some other period in the existence of the English language, and that his texts should be translated. That's one of the ideas of people who are not specialists in literature or in the history of the language. One of the ideas which is popularly voiced. Is it really true that Shakespeare requires translation? If we look at his texts, which we all know, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him, and so on, we will see that everything is clear in the text. All the words, if their spelling is changed to modern spelling, and modern editions of Shakespeare, of course, do not reproduce the spelling system of the 16th century, which Shakespeare himself used in his texts, that when written in the modern orthography, the texts are absolutely clear. And that if we come across words like from to be or not to be, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, makes calamity of so long life, pangs of despised love, the law's delay, insolence of office, and so on. If we do not know these words, it simply means that the words are rarely used in modern English. They are expressive, but they are, in fact, words of modern English. These are not words that have been used 5 centuries ago and then disappeared. They, in fact, remain. It's another matter that they name either the emotional states, the abstract notions, or some concrete objects, which either are not very actively mentioned in ordinary discussions, or name objects which are not very often used in real life. And for this reason, it might seem that the text should be translated. In fact, dictionaries should be opened and not texts should be translated. And as for the grammatical system, we have the constant usage of thou, thee, thy, thine, the old forms of pronouns, second person singular. Now we are accustomed to the fact that when we need to say T and we use the same pronoun you, your, yours. But in the English language of Shakespeare's time, also the second person pronoun singular could be found, but that's practically the only serious grammatical distinction that we have between Shakespeare's style and modern English. So if he uses rare words, which are still part of the language, if he introduces individual word combinations, they can be created by authors of modern poetry as well. it's another matter that the models may be rare. If he uses second person singular, the pronoun thou, these differences are not connected with the change of the people. It's the peculiarity of his text, but his collected works collectively belong to modern English. If we compare it with the history of Russian literature, we will find a dramatic difference between what Shakespeare wrote, for example, and what we have in our literary tradition. For us, Russian literature probably begins, modern Russian literature, maybe with the 18th century, although I doubt it. Maybe it begins later. Ломоносов, Третьяковский, Кантемир, Державин, we know the names, but I doubt very much that we know some of their texts by heart. Богоподобная царевна Киргиз-Кайсацкие Орды, I am not sure this is part of our everyday knowledge of Russian poetry. So for us, the name of the author whom we may quote easily is Pushkin, and with him the tradition is not more than 200 years long, while with the English literary tradition is 500 years. So the difference objectively is there. It's another matter that in the 19th century our writers made an enormous collective effort and managed to produce something that had been already present in European literature and went even further with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov creating texts which were quite modern in the opinion of their Western colleagues and readers, and which allowed Russian literature not to lag behind the European tradition, but probably to get to the advanced stages of its development. But it all happened during a century. And with the English language, more time was given to the authors. And from this point of view, English is a unique language with its modern period lasting for about 500 years. And so we may confidently speak of classic English poetry in its modern understanding and with the conviction that it will be understood by the reader without much effort from the beginning of the 16th century. Quite a significant characteristic. What about the other periods in the existence of the English literary tradition that I have already mentioned? I've said that there are three basic periods in the history of the English language. All of them are connected not just with some linguistic features, but with certain names of significant authors, significant writers, and at the same time, they are connected with the political situation in the country. So what are the periods we have just specified? It's Old English, which begins somewhere in the 6th, probably 5th century. We can't be sure about the beginning because it all goes back to this hypothetic general Germanic language, Proto-Germanic language, from which later Scandinavian languages appeared, the German language, the Gothic language, Old English. It's all hypothetical to a certain extent, and Proto-Germanic is not something that is fixed in any kind of written text. It's a hypothesis that all these languages had a common ancestor. So it's difficult to say when it all began, but the general theory is initially people who speak modern English or spoke Old English, they were not the inhabitants of England. They came there from the north of Europe. The authentic, the indigenous tribes were either destroyed, killed, or ousted to the margins of the cultural process. And those tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, came from various parts of Europe. And in the 6th century, they were obviously the masters in the land. So the beginning is somewhat blurred. The end is clear. It's the year 1066, which is confidently mentioned as the end of the Old English period. Then comes Middle English, beginning with 1066 and ending approximately about the year 1500. And then comes Modern English, with this distinction into early modern, 2 centuries, and modern, which had begun about the year 1700 and which is lasting until now. So what was specific about Old English, and why was it that it finished so abruptly? Old English was the language with the grammatical system based on the general principles of organizing the language in all Germanic countries. Grammatically, it contained a complicated verbal system. You probably remember 7 classes of strong verbs, 3 in the case of English classes of weak verbs. In the Gothic language there were 4. In English, in Old English, they were reduced. With a complicated lexical system, the verbal paradigms were complicated. The paradigms of nouns were complicated as well. So there would be both conjugation, declension, станение, спряжение, and lexically, etymologically, the words either would belong to the Old Germanic stock, or they would go back to Latin and Greek languages and to Scandinavian languages, some of the words which are frequently used in modern English, like get and give. These are Scandinavian borrowings. If we follow the rules of the English language, they should be read as jet and jive, but in fact, they were borrowed like this from Scandinavian languages, and their modern pronunciation and spelling reflect the way they had been pronounced about 1,000 years ago. So that was the actual form of the language, complicated grammatical system, and the authentic words, either belonging to the Old Germanic stock or sometimes borrowed if they were connected with certain cultural phenomena, and especially when they were connected with religion or the abstract notions. These would be often called with the help of the words going back to the Latin and ancient Greek languages. That was what Old English looked like. And it must be borne in mind that initially it was not, of course, one unified language. The status of the language was intimately connected with the general political situation in the then England. England in the 7th, in the 8th, in the 9th century was not a unified country. It consisted of several minor kingdoms like Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, whose leaders were constantly fighting with each other. And of course, there could be no unified language in such conditions. It was the collection of dialects, some of them sufficiently similar to be understood, some of them are really difficult for understanding. But at some point, the gradual process of unifying the language and of standardizing it started. And this period naturally was connected with the unification of England, when it was becoming the unified country itself. And in these conditions, it would be natural to expect the unification of the language. When did England become, in the Old English period, a relatively unified country? When did it happen? At what century, and who is the king with whose activities is this unification of England connected? In English history, there is one king who is called Great. We have Catherine the Great in Russia, we have Peter the Great. In England, there was only one king who was called Great, and it's Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, with the center at Winchester. He is usually given the title of a person who had unified the lands. In fact, it was not during his reign that England became a unified country. It was his son, Edward the Elder, who did the work, but as it often happens in history, certain great deeds are ascribed to a person who only partly was responsible for doing what he is credited with having done. So Alfred began this process of unification and his son finished it. But it is for his extraordinary political acumen and his great support of education that Alfred is called the Great, the only king in the history of England. What was specific in the 9th century? Why was it that Alfred had to do some kind of serious work? When he became King of England, King of Wessex, in the year 1871, England was greatly oppressed by the Danes. It would be wrong to call them the Chen. They are the Scandinavian tribe, of course, associated with the present-day Denmark, but probably historically it would be more accurate to say that they were the Danes, Dani, and not people connected with modern Denmark. These were belligerent people who loved fighting and who didn't love working, they preferred to rob the people whom they had defeated. And their approach was, when the Danes came, they would slaughter people, they would steal the goods, the money, the cattle, and some of them might remain, or they would simply return to their original places of dwelling. The Danes were the plague of the Anglo-Saxons because they were very well trained as a military group, and as there was no union among the minor rulers of England, it was easy for the Danes to deal with each particular little kingdom separately. If there had been a unified resistance, probably the Danes would have felt less comfortable. But in fact, they felt what they felt. And when Alfred just became King of Wessex, the country was oppressed by the Danes, like the rest of England. Alfred had to spend some years in disguise, though he was a crowned king. But sometime later, he managed to organize resistance to the Danes, and after some years of war, they were kicked out from England. Sometimes money would be paid to them, but at least some agreement was reached. And Alfred became the full-fledged ruler of his country. And then the process of the unification of England took place. And the centuries after Alfred's death, 1.5 centuries, were the time when England was a unified country. The 10th century and part of the 11th century were very fruitful politically for England, because when a big political entity is formed and is functioning properly, it's possible not only for the trade to flourish and for agriculture to function properly, but also it's the matter of economics, finance, and also education. When there are no internal wars, no external wars, countries are developing much more actively and effectively than it would have happened under the less favorable conditions. The literary tradition had already existed in England before Alfred. There had been religious texts, and there would be scientific, academic texts written by some English people. Of course, most of them were monks, the group of population who were educated. And a scholar of international repute, for example, who was living in England and at the same time who was the glory of the international scientific community, was Bede the Venerable, Beda Достопочтенный, who lived in the second part of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century. He was the author of the Church History of England. He wrote some treatises devoted to natural sciences. He was writing in Latin only, but in his History of the English Church, he mentions the illiterate shepherd called Cadman, who wrote in Old English some religious verses, and Bede quotes this author. Maybe it's a legendary figure just invented by this learned monk, but all the same, already at the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century, there existed a developed tradition of writing religious texts in Latin, and some of them would be produced in English as well. Apart from religious texts and, of course, colloquial texts which were never written down, during the reign of Alfred the Great, there appeared the important historical text on the history of England. It was called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it begins somewhere during the reign of Alfred, and it continued with interruptions to be written until the beginning of the 12th century. Of course, the style was not very complicated. It was the style of communication style, communicative language, communicative style, not the proper literary historical text, a complicated one. But at least the genre of historical writing was also developing. And after the death of Alfred, the tradition was continued still further, and side by side with the devotional texts, historical texts, there appeared lyrical poems, there appeared a translation of the Bible by Elfric, not Alfred, but Elfric, and even a novel in the modern understanding of the term was created, which is called Apollonius of Tyre. So it's really a great collection of achievements for a period of time which goes back 1,000 years. Compare it to what we know about the Russian literature of the time. Of course, the Russians were not writing novels at that time. With the English people, as we see, the situation was exceptionally promising. And then, after all these texts were written, an event took place which made the further existence of the English language look problematic, to say the least of it. And this event, which took place in 1066, was the famous Norman Conquest. The Norman Conquest. It so happened that the last representative of the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty had no children. His name was Edward the Confessor. And Edward the Confessor had no children, so his throne could be bequeathed to some of his relatives. And one of the claimants to the throne was the famous person who in the future would be called William the Conqueror. And he was Duke of Normandy. Excuse me. Originally, he was a bastard. He was an illegitimate child of the Duke of Normandy. He had some northern blood in his veins. And so people who would be called Normans, and there is usually the double explanation, either because they came from Normandy or because they came from the north, being initially Scandinavian tribes settling in the north of France. So those Normans, headed by William the Conqueror, one of the claimants as the successors of Edward the Confessor, they came to England, and after some brief, though decisive, fights with other claimants, William was proclaimed King of England. And in this case, the change of the political power brought about some very considerable cultural changes. The thing is that William had brought with himself a considerable amount of local French aristocrats, the learned monks, the administrators, who all of them spoke some dialect of the French language, those Frankish dialects. And the English language was absolutely alien to these people, and William the Conqueror did not feel like learning the language of the subjects of his defeated kingdom. And as a result, after the English language had reached the status of the official language of the land, due to the efforts of Alfred the Great and his successors, and the language was used everywhere, with the exception of official texts and of religious texts. But even in such cases, sometimes there would be the authentic language used. Instead of being the national language, English becomes a collection of dialects, because the official languages of the state during William the Conqueror's reign and further were French and Latin. I'm not going to specify which kind of French it was, because it's a complicated question historically. But the important point is that definitely it was not English. And in this situation, when people at the head of the country are writing in French and Latin, are speaking French and Latin, we understand that the English language could exist only very modestly, probably occasionally used in writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of some literary texts, which are extremely limited in number. But the general tendency was towards it becoming a collection of mutually incomprehensible dialects and gradually disappeared. That's why the year 1066 is used conveniently as a marking point, turning point in the history of English. The language stopped being the national language, it became a collection of dialects, and there was another very serious point connected with the impoverishment of the language. As we understand, languages are developing, not so much because their grammatical system changes, for example, but because people learn more about the world, some objects, new objects appear in the world, and to reflect their knowledge, they need new words. So the expansion of the language is primarily connected with vocabulary. In the Old English times, when it was necessary to produce a new word, the word would be produced either with the help of the authentic Germanic material, or sometimes with the help of borrowings from from Latin and ancient Greek, and these borrowings would be assimilated. And so there was the obvious tendency in the Old English period of the development of language in this expansive direction lexicon. When French and Latin became the domineering presence, the new words for the new concrete objects, abstract objects, and so on, were formed with the help of the French language. They were not even assimilated because there was no need for it. And when certain borrowings were necessary, the Franks would borrow from Latin, and the vocabulary would develop already without any participation of the Germanic language like English. That's why the turning point of the year 1066 marks, first of all, the change in the linguistic policy towards naming concrete and abstract objects and notions. The sources change, and it's no longer the original Germanic word stock that provides material. It's French and Latin. And English becomes much poorer, and it can be seen that nothing is really appearing in the language, and a lot of things are disappearing, beginning with the year 1066. And it's difficult to judge what the language really looked like at that time, simply because not so many literary texts survive. On the whole, very few of them survive, written in different dialects. And it was quite likely that finally the English language, the way we know it, could have completely disappeared or could have existed on the level of the Irish language in its today's form. But the language was lucky. Probably the nation was lucky as well, because after the 3 centuries of this rather humiliating existence, suddenly, in the middle of the 14th century, English began rapidly to regain its status of a literary language. What was it connected with? Why was it that somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, the status of the English language changed completely? Почему вдруг в XIV веке радикально поменялась ситуация со статусом английского языка в Англии? The situation changed dramatically because in the year 1337, the 100 Years' War between England and France began. And it became manifestly unpatriotic on the part of the English people to speak the language of the enemy. And as a result, the linguistic situation began to change. It couldn't change with the rapidity of our modern times. It took time for people to start using the English language in the situations when they had usually been using French. But 1337, all the same, was a turning point in the history of England and of the English language, because at that time it became absolutely clear that it was no longer possible to use French as the official language of the state and the official language of the court. And so efforts were made by different groups of people to begin using the language in various spheres of national communication. For example, in the year 1362, the first ever opening of the sessions of the parliament in English took place. Before that, the English parliament, which existed from the second decade of the 13th century, it had existed for about 150 years already. It had always been conducted in French. But here, 25 years after the 100 Years' War began, the opening of the parliament at last took place in English. And the development of the language here again was mainly connected with the lexical borrowings, with making the language capable of describing all the situations in which people using it potentially may be involved. What do we call a literary language? Literary language is not something that possesses literature. Oh. When we speak of a national developed literary language, we mean that all spheres of human communication may be covered with the help of this language. That is the idea of national literary languages. And in England, gradually, there appeared a tradition of covering all spheres of national communication with the help of English, with the exception of religious sermons. The books, the church books were written in Latin. And if some scientific treatises, what we consider science now, philosophy, for example, or some scholastic works in the spirit of Aristotle, if they were created, they would be written in Latin as well, because Latin was the international language of the then science. But whatever the possible limitations could have been, the second part of the 14th century saw the great change in the history of the English language. And it was connected with the fact that more and more spheres of natural communication in England would be covered with the help of the English language. There were grammatical changes, and as borrowings came mainly from French, they were assimilated according to the phonetic laws of the English language. The English language did not become some kind of Romance Germanic language all the same. It remained Germanic because its grammatical system is Germanic and its phonetic system is specifically Germanic. And the words borrowed were assimilated according to the phonotactic rules of the English language. But statistically, if we look at the dictionaries of the English language, we will find out that approximately 70% of English words are borrowings. It's another matter that these are not the most frequently used words. If we look at texts, we will see that still the old Germanic stock, if not predominates, at least it is used equally frequently. But if we look at the list of words in the dictionary and not at texts, we will see, of course, that Romance borrowings prevail. But all the same, the English language assimilated them, and compared to the Old English period, it was changing grammatically and for the benefit of those who used it. The old complicated system of conjugation and declensions was disappearing. Now we have those irregular verbs which go back to the old system of strong verbs. The nominal system is dramatically different. We have no case forms with the exception of possessive case and with the pronouns, this very small group of words where the old system of cases remains. So the lexical growth and the grammatical simplification were the characteristic features of the Middle English period. And then comes modern English with its furthering of the lexical level, really with a great vowel shift, which would take place a bit later, and it is connected with the invention of printing in the second part of the 15th century in Germany by this famous printer called Gutenberg. So these are the brief things, the brief information I would like to introduce about the English literary tradition and English history at the moment. We see how intricate it all was, and of course we will discuss all these things in much greater detail. But I would like to finish the lecture with some illustrations to the thesis which were formulated previously, connected with the amount of historical and cultural information we require when we read a text of verbal art. So, one point concerning English classical poetry is that we have a very long history to consider. And the second point concerning any kind of poetry is that when we are interpreting texts, we need various amounts, various quantities of extra-linguistic information. I've included several examples to be considered. 3 texts which need greater attention in terms of their historical interpretation, or no attention. And a very good example of a text which may be understood without the knowledge of who the author is and at what time it was written is Shakespeare's sonnet number 18. I've given the Russian translation as well. So, a text that requires no commentary. We need to know only the words, the lexis, to be able to understand it, but not really anything additional. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf has all too short a date. Sometimes to hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall thus brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as man can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. If anything is unclear, it might be just connected with the changes in the word order, specific word order used by Shakespeare, but no historical and cultural information is necessary. When we look at the text, the famous monologue from Julius Caesar, we, of course, do require some commentary. And this commentary will be connected with the historical situation which Shakespeare describes. A group of Roman conspirators kill Julius Caesar because they think he had displayed the tendency towards becoming a tyrant. And they managed to explain to the population of Rome why it was necessary to kill Caesar. And the only trouble they still have is connected with the fact that the best friend of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, is still living. And the conspirators want to kill him as well, but Brute, who is suffering because of his betrayal of Caesar, says that there had been enough bloodshed, and he advises his friends to leave Mark Antony alone, because killing him would be like cutting off limbs from the body which had already been beheaded. But though Mark Antony is alive, he wants to revenge his friend's death. He wants to address the populace of Rome, explaining to them that these people who had killed Caesar were criminals and that justice should be done. He can't say it at once directly because people would not support him, and he invents a very cunning way of rhetorically convincing the audience that after all Julius Caesar was not that bad and that the conspirators were not at all good. He begins to mention the good deeds of Caesar, but he constantly interrupts himself, saying that of course, Caesar did these good things, but in fact, the conspirators were right when they called him a tyrant. The conspirators are honorable men. Brutus is an honorable man, and as the information concerning Caesar bluntly contradicts this statement, and after he repeats it several times, the Romans become doubtful about the nobility of the conspirators, and then Mark Antony addresses them directly, saying, "You loved Caesar, there were reasons for you to love him. Why don't you weep for him when we are at his burial? Wild beasts have more brain than you, people of Rome." And according to Shakespeare, this monologue convinced the Romans that Brutus was not an honorable man, the conspirators were not honorable men, and then the rebellion against the conspirators begins, and Caesar's death is revenged. So here a historical commentary is necessary, but it is limited, and the situation with the murder of Caesar is the common knowledge with most educated people. So only some commentary is necessary, including the linguistic one, connected with the intricate use of certain repetitions by Shakespeare. So another text which needs great explanation, but not so great always. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus has told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, I believe of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men? Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He has brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? Whether the poor have cried, Caesar has wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Liverpool, I thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure, he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Пора закругляться, у нас не остается времени на третий текст. Я коротко повторю, да? Значит, мы выяснили, что такое классическая поэзия, определение ее. Некоторые тексты можно рассматривать в изоляции, вне контекста. Для понимания некоторых текстов требуется знание историко-культурной ситуации. Ну, вот два примера было. Сонет можно понять вообще без всяких экскурсов. Friends Romans Countrymen желательно знать исторический контекст. Ну и дальше была относительно пространная, но можно более подробно про это говорить, периодизация. Была описана более-менее пространное развитие английского языка, специфика английского языка, специфика английской поэтической традиции по сравнению с русской. Вот приблизительно об этом будет курс. Естественно, XVI век нас будет интересовать и далее периоды сильно больше, чем предшествующие, потому что это не современный английский. Но, тем не менее, чтобы представить себе, откуда взялись великие авторы XVI века, в том числе Шекспир, о более ранних этапах существования английского языка тоже необходимо будет поговорить. Ну вот, пока так. Вводная лекция. To be continued. Всем спасибо. До следующей встречи.
Спасибо, всего доброго.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Спасибо, до свидания.